Hello, everybody, and welcome to our October session for Docker integration. And this month, we want to cover some of the newly released features in TIBCO Cloud Integration. My name is Jeff Leviton. I'm a customer success engineer with TIBCO, and welcome to our session. So we have our usual disclaimers. I think most importantly is that any discussions about future features or product roadmaps, that is, those are all speculation and really shouldn't plan any of your integrations or business processes based upon any future functionality that may be in the product. But we do have a great session this month because we do want to focus on some of the recent additions we've made. All right. So I want to cover both improvements to Flogo as well as TCI Connect, also known as Scribe. So Flogo, there's a couple new triggers in Flogo, which give us the ability to execute flows at the beginning and end of when an application starts and when an application stops. Also, there's some other new activities within Flogo around to enable asynchronous processing for REST calls, as well as the ability to do better branching with our if functionality. TCI Connect has a few new features. These are across the core, the iPaaS, as well as one of our connectors. So there's some new agent security options that we have in our security system. And this is useful for reprocessing failed rows and complying with data storage requirements. We've improved the mapper for TCI Connect. The smart mapper now has some additional functionality in it, and we'll cover that. And also, we made improvements to the mapper connector, and this was part of both improvements to the core product as well as the functionality of the connector itself. And when we come to that example, you'll see how those two are connected. All right. So in Flogo, we have two new triggers. We have a trigger for App Startup Trigger and App Shutdown Trigger. Now, these triggers do not require any parameters. And there's no configuration, no parameters, no input or output configured with these particular triggers in Flogo. And because of that, there's no upstream output in a mapper. Usually when you have a trigger in Flogo, you can use values from that trigger further on in your app in the flow. But because these triggers simply for application startup and application shutdown, then there is no upstream output in that. These are executed once per instance. So if you have, and there's some subtleties in this in terms of what happens when you scale up, when you scale down, and we'll go over the different cases for this, right? We'll show you some examples on this. But basically, every time you scale up or scale down an application, it's going to trigger the application startup and the application shutdown, all right? And it's important to understand how that works when you have multiple instances deployed, and then what happens when you push a new flow out to those instances. So there's sort of some base use cases we'll show in the examples, as well as some other more advanced examples, right? It's also, just as a general rule here, it's also possible to have multiple flows with a single trigger. So you could have an app startup trigger that could have multiple flows. Say there were multiple flows you wanted to execute, you wanted to split them up in different flows. It's also possible to have multiple triggers of the same type, all right? And we'll jump into that example right now to kind of show you what that all looks like. All right. So here we are in Flogo, and the connection that we're going to be using for this is a basic MySQL connection. And this is, if you've seen some of our sessions before, you know that this particular connection is just a sort of a basic MySQL database that emulates an ERP system, some type of basic system with contacts and leads. And additionally, there are some logging tables in this particular database, right? So so let's look at the flow. Let's head back to our apps. And for the flow here, all right, let's look at the flows that we have here. So we can see that we can either use the flow view or the trigger view, all right? And in this case, when we use the trigger view, we see that we have two separate triggers for the application startup. And if I wanted to add another trigger, another flow on this trigger here, what I would do is I'd head over here, I'd click new flow, and then it would add it to this particular group right here. Now there's a separate group that also has the same trigger, and these are going to all execute in order. So let's look at what this looks like from a basic perspective here. All right. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to scale this down, and then I'm going to change and push this out to kind of show what this looks like. All right. So we'll just start back. We'll just get back and start with 0 instances deployed here. This is stopping, and then we'll kind of start from scratch on this. All right. So head over to application startup here. Let's see what this looks like. So what we've done here is we've added this trigger, and this is basically just an application startup trigger. If you were to do this from a new flow perspective here, you would basically say create a flow. All right. You could either select the existing trigger, a new flow. All right, we could test here. And then when you created this, you could start with a trigger, and you can use the existing trigger here, or I can add a new trigger and make a separate one there. And that's basically how you get to these triggers here. All right. We'll just cancel this and go back and delete this particular flow because it's not really doing anything for us, right? So we'll just delete this one here. I just want to show you where that is in terms of how you create it. It's just a top level trigger you can use anytime. So for this one, let's look at what this looks like here. So we have this trigger. There are no parameters in this trigger, right? And the flow inputs and outputs here, there's also no flow inputs and outputs. We could add flow inputs and outputs, but that doesn't really make any sense because there is no way you can actually access the inputs and outputs via your the flow, because the trigger doesn't have any way to return those values. So it's really, we're looking at an empty trigger with no values, and we're looking at no values for the input and output here. But now what I do here is, a little thing you can do is use the little trick you can use. You can use the mapper connector as sort of a place to store parameters or values that you're going to want to use. I mean, you could, in theory, just put those values directly into the activity where you're using them. What I chose to do here was I created a schema that shows our event log, right? And this is the schema we're going to use for event log. This schema is similar to the schema that we have with our schema that we have in the database, all right? So we have 3 basic fields here. We have the event type, the event date and time, and then a quick note here, all right? So what I decided to do here for this mapper was use the schema, and on the inputs, I did event type here, application startup, event date and time is just the current date and time using one of our date and time functions, and the note is this one. I'm just going to change this real quick here so we can see what it looks like when we deploy this, all right? So I'm going to go through and actually change all these so we can see what it looks like when we redeploy this. So we'll head over to the mapper, and then on the input here, we see that we've changed the note. We're going to put a single B here. This is the second one. These are all exactly the same, except that there's just the note is slightly different in all these. All right, so head over here, head over the input. We'll see what the note is here, and then we'll just change that to CC. All right, to C, and save that out. Now, what this MySQL insert does is we're using the connection for MySQL. On the input settings, we're saying insert into our table event log, the event date, the event type, and the note, and the values are going to come. We're configuring these values as parameters in our activity. Right? And just if you think about activities as functions, then these are basically the input values of the function here. So the input setting tells us where we're going to get the input values. And now the actual inputs are how we assign those values. So we go over the input, we go over the parameters, and in the event date, we're going to pull this from the mapper. Now we see that there's this upstream output, all right? Just go back here to the mapper, and I wanted to comment on this. So notice how when we're on the input here and we're setting our inputs, notice how there's no upstream input here. And sometimes you'll have upstream input from any previous activities. That's essentially the output of those activities. And also the trigger will give you values often, but in this case, there are no values coming out of the trigger. So I just want to show you, confirm that's what that looks like when you attempt to use the mapper here, is there are no upstream values you can actually use, right? So then we do this MySQL insert statement. We're setting up, this is the query that we're going to execute. The input is going to come via these are all going to come via the mapper. So the parameters here, this event date comes from the mapper, this event type comes from the mapper, and this node comes from the mapper here also, right? And the output is just the rows affected and last insert ID, okay? And there's no looping in here because we're just doing a single input on this, all right? So now when we head back here, all right, so let's head over to our MySQL database. Let me bring that up real fast here. All right, this is a previous table. I'm just going to truncate that table so we can start with a clear event log. So let's start with a clear event log table here. We see this is now there's nothing in this event log. All right. And now let's, the application is currently stopped. All right. But let's push the application. And push is really, push is a compile and deploy. All right. So what this is going to do, it's going to compile this into the JSON and get it ready to be deployed. All right. But now there are currently no instances running for this. Let's just check. Let's just wait a minute here while this is getting deployed. What's happening behind the scenes is this is getting compiled and it's getting ready to be able to deploy it out once we scale it up to our instances. All right. And we're not going to see any activity here because technically the application is currently in the stopped state. All right. So currently, if there are no instances and then we push the application remains in the stop state, and none of these triggers are actually executed here. All right. But now let's just see what happens when we spin up one instance here, and let's scale this up to one instance. All right. Now, what we're going to expect to see here are these three. Is this application startup to be a trigger on these three flows, and we should expect to see three values in the table here. All right. And we'll give it a second here for this to scale up and deploy out to TIBCO Cloud. What we will see here ultimately is we will see, yep, now we see that we see three. So basically one instance is spun up. This was executed 3 times. Again, I'm just doing this for 3 times just to demonstrate that you can actually have multiple flows in different configurations for this particular trigger, right? Most of the time, what you're probably going to have is just a single trigger for app startup and then a single flow attached to it, right? Just like we have for the app shutdown here. So the shutdown one is just a single flow and a single trigger, right? So now we see that there are 3 that that these 3 flows have executed, and that's what we'd expect when we spin this up when we do one instance. All right. So now if we do another instance and scale it up to another instance, all right, then what we're going to see here is we should see another set of these because it's going to execute these 3 flows once we've done it. Once we've this is scaled up and deployed to the cloud, and then we'll see another set of 3. All right. So basically, what this does is it just every time you scale it up, it's going to execute this app startup because it's not from zero. It's not just from 0 to anything. It's anytime you go up. That's how many are going to get. That's how many times the trigger is going to be activated. And we can see here now we have 2 instances running, and we have you can see these are done in reverse order, A, B, C, and these are in reverse chronological order. So these are A, B, C, and A, B, C. All right. Now, if we go down one, we should expect to see the app shutdown scaled. We should expect to see one app shutdown because we've gone from 2 to 1. So one of our apps has shut down. All right. And then now we should expect to see an application shutdown. And here we go. We have this event type app shutdown, and this is the application shutdown node. All right. And this happened here. We can see that it's still catching up. The UI is still catching up from when the application got shut down. So we went from 2 to 1. We got the shutdown notice. All right. So now after that, so let's scale this up. Let's scale this back up to 2. All right. So we're going to expect to see another couple here. All right. And then what I want to do is I'm going to retruncate this table just so we can get a fresh start on this. And we'll expect to see another set of these once this gets scaled up to 2. And then we're going to clear the table and see what happens when we push new application. All right. All right. So give it a minute to get everything spun up here and going, and we'll see. We should see another set of these pushed out into the database. All right. A little patience on that. So again, the thing to remember here is that it's really easy to create this application startup. Just create a flow with this trigger, and the same thing with the application shutdown. All right. So now we head over to our database. We see that, yes, we've created 3 more here. All right, 3 more. So this basically just means that we spun up 1 more. Okay, now let's go in and let's change each one of these. All right. Let's go into the input, and we'll change each one of these notes to 3 A's, and we'll save that. Okay. And we'll validate, and everything looks good. All right. And then what we'll do here is we'll do this one here. We're going to the mapper on this input, and we'll change this so we can see that we've made a change to the application. All right. Okay, and that looks good here. And then we're going to head over here, and then we're going to head over to the mapper on this one. I'm going to change this to CCC on this. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's give that a minute to sync up to the cloud. Head back in here. Okay, so now what we've done is we have changed all of these, okay? And now what we want to do is we want to push this out. And what's going to happen here, think about what happens behind the scenes. What happens is we push this out. What it's going to do is actually it's going to spin up, it's going to spin up one instance and then shut down, and then do a shutdown on the existing one, kind of like a swap, and then it's going to spin up another instance, and it's going to shut down that second one, right? So the shutdown, so when I do the push, right, I'm going to end up, what's going to happen is the application startup is going to be triggered once for each push, and the application shutdown is going to be triggered, once for each instance, and then the application shutdown is also going to be triggered once for each instance. And let's push that out here, and then see how this works. So currently what's happening now is TIBCO Cloud is deploying this, right? And it is it's spinning up instances. It's going to shut down. There's like a swap that's happening behind the scenes. And this I just sort of inferred. I actually didn't talk with the DevOps team or anything. I just I'm inferring this based upon the order of operations, right? So once this is done, we'll head over to the database and we'll see the order of operations of how this is particularly going to be executed, right? And we should see that pretty clearly how that works. Right. All right. In the meantime, we can head over while this is going on. Let's head over to our other back here, and we'll head over to our new activities. All right. So we have a couple new activities, and these activities we have in this example here. We have this little truncate MySQL table, and what we have in this case is we have this new NoOp. All right. Now, if you understand how the branching works within Flogo, all right, you realize that the branching works after an activity is executed, and the branching can trap errors and such. Right. The thing is that you would need some type of operation here in order to do just simple branching. So say I just want to do simple branching based upon some incoming value. All right. Previously, what we would do is you would use a log. You'd write out to the log, something out to the log as a dummy block, and then you would branch off of that. There was also a NoOp that was available in our Git our Git repository, right? But now we've made this an activity here. Basically, this NoOp, again, there is no input, no output. All it's really useful for is to be able to do the branching. All right. So we see here that we have this branching set up. We're going to do success. We're going to check out the condition on this. The condition is basically saying is if the incoming table parameter is called event log. And what does this do? This is basically going to truncate the MySQL table, and we see that we have our this is a REST endpoint, and it's called truncate. Our output settings are really nothing. The flow to input is just the query parameters coming in for the table. The reply setting is just a simple message, and that's pretty straightforward in how that's configured. And our schema is basically a pretty simple schema here, where we have a query parameter called the table, and basically this is kind of your standard REST endpoint setup. All right. Then we use the mapper here to just set the input on the table. All right, we're just pulling the table from the query parameter. All right, we didn't have to do that, but we just did. And then now we're going to do the branch off this NoOp. All right, and then these different branches basis is going to trigger. This is going to delete one table. It's going to delete another table if there's an error. If none of these values match, then it's going to return an error. All right. So we've done basically, we're just using the NoOp as a branching mechanism, and then we're just going to branch off of that. All right. Pretty straightforward how that works. Let's head back to our instances here. Now we see we have 2 running instances. Let's head over to what that looks like in the database table. All right. So we can see what we've done here is, so this is the last one. The last one we spun up was C. So notice what it does is this is the single application startup trigger, and then it does a shutdown. Then it does another startup, then it does another shutdown. So the order of operations is it starts and then shuts down afterwards, which kind of makes sense if you think about what's happening behind the scenes, is that we're going to spin up these new deployments, these new instances, and then we're going to shut down the previous instance. All right. That's just a subtlety of how that's going to work. It still does track. It still does record it, and those triggers are still activated. It's just key to remember that this here will do this. This is startup. This is shutdown, and the push will do that for all instances that you have. All right. So now let's look like what this truncate table looks like. So we have 2 things we're using the NoOp, but we're also using the ReplyToTrigger. And the ReplyToTrigger. So previously in Flogo, what would happen is you'd have to execute all of the activities within the flow before you could return. All right. Now what you can do is you can return, and then the flow will still continue to process. And what is this for? Quite simply, asynchronous processing, right? So previously you used to have some type of return function. Now we have asynchronous processing with this ReplyToTrigger. This ReplyToTrigger is just like you'd expect with any type of reply. We're just putting out the data, what the message looks like here. All right. And that's pretty straightforward. All right. So this is the basic of the message as far as what our output schema looks like. And that just gets pushed back up. All right. Let's head over to Postman and see what that looks like. All right. And so here's our, here's our endpoint. All right. And here's our parameter event log. When we send this off, we immediately get back a 200 that it was okay. And then it's going to go here, return that, and it's going to continue execution behind the scenes. And once we head over here and we refresh this table, we see that we actually truncated that table using this particular operation here. And this is what this does. This is basically truncate the event log table right here. All right. So again, this is just a simple REST example that demonstrates how we can reply to the trigger immediately and then do some type of asynchronous processing behind the scenes. So again, this could be much more longer and involved. It could be reaching out to a lot of different other endpoints and pulling things in, but it does give you the ability to do something that's asynchronous and then continue processing there. All right. So again, here we have our 2 new activities, our NoOp. This is useful for conditional branching, and then I ReplyToTrigger. All right. So these are some really great improvements to Flogo, the ability to trigger triggers for start and stop applications, and then these new ReplyToTrigger to allow us asynchronous, and the NoOp to give us better branching options. All right. So now let's head over to TCI Connect, also known as Scribe. And what we've done here is we've improved the agent security settings. All right. Let's do review quickly what we're talking about when we're talking about what data we're storing. So with the TCI Connect, as you loop through the records, if there's an error in one of the operations, what it does is it records the source data for that particular record, and it also records the error for that record. Then at a future date, you can reprocess those records. And when you reprocess those records, you reprocess using the cached data that was stored. All right. And that data is stored in a couple places. It's stored in our iPaaS. That source data actually has can contain personal identifiable information, right? Personal information. Why is that? Because you say you're upserting a contact to Salesforce, first name, last name, email. That's all PI, right? So that information does get stored in execution history, and that is used to reprocess records. Right? Now, previously you used to be able to we had a flag which allowed you to store it to not store it in the cloud, in the iPaaS, right? But it was still stored in the cloud agents. So if you don't store it in the iPaaS, then the agents have a database, that a cache database of these, and then that's the data source that's used when you reprocess. So what we've done is we've given you a lot tighter control over where that's stored, so you can store it only in the on-premise agent, or only in the cloud agent, or in the iPaaS also, or you can store it nowhere. All right. So when you configure this, head over to Environment and Tools, Security Settings. So let's see what this looks like. Pretty straightforward. Environment and Tools. And then Security Settings. All right. And again, just notice these filters over here. So I can filter these just for Connect, which is Scribe. And these are the security settings that go along with Scribe here. Okay. And where this is going to be, it's going to be on the left-hand side. All right. So if you do want to capture failed records processing, you have to select to store it on either the cloud agent or the on-premise agent. All right. And if you do keep failed records local, all right, then what it does is it doesn't store it in the iPaaS. All right. So this is basically keep failed records local do not store it in the iPaaS. And so this configuration right here is probably what you're looking for if you are security conscious, because this configuration right here will prevent you from storing any data in our cloud. All right. So keep failed records local means do not store it in our iPaaS. Also, the cloud agents could also is in our infrastructure, and the data could be stored there. So if you uncheck this, then you're good to go. This is the normal configuration when you come out of the box. All right. Now, if you don't want to store it anywhere, then you uncheck that, and then now the failed record information is not going to be stored anywhere at all. All right. So it's just good to understand how the configuration for this works and what the default value is. The default value is going to be this, and then it's going to be all enabled like this. And then the most common one is going to be to store records only on the on-premise agent is this. And this is for GDPR as well as security reasons. So if you have that on-premise agent, if that's on infrastructure that the customer controls, that the end user is controlling, then that PI is never going to end up anywhere stored in our cloud infrastructure, right? So this is the base of the configuration. If you are going to reprocess records, you want to use. If you're not going to reprocess records, uncheck that. Data is going to be stored nowhere, but you've also now removed the ability to do that record reprocessing. Right? So we've given you some more levers you can use to tune your security setup. Pretty straightforward. We've basically added a couple new flags on there, and just want to make sure you understand how those work and what the implications are for that. All right. So now what we've done is another thing we've done is we've improved the mapper in TCI Connect. And really, that's one of the best things about TCI Connect is the tool itself is extraordinarily easy to use, and you can very quickly be up and running with fairly complex integrations using just the out of the box and basic functionality. So let's see what that looks like what the new functionality looks like. All right, so head to our apps, and again, notice here if I select our on schedule apps, these are going to be our Connect applications, and then we're going to go over here and we're going to our workshop examples. We're going to look at some of the ones we have for the workshop. All right. So let's look at how the smart mapper works at the top level. All right. And we can probably just go through this one I've already done, but I'll walk you through what it looks like. All right. So this opens up the Flow editor. And we know that the way that TCI Connect works is this block diagram. Flogo goes horizontally and TCI Connect goes vertically. All right. So that's, otherwise they're very similar in terms of their design principles, right? We have functional blocks that you drag in, and then the functional blocks are certain types of operations, and you can have inputs and outputs to that. So for this one, what we do for this is we have, again, this is a common example that I use. I have a MySQL database, and I'm going to integrate that with our Salesforce. So we query the contacts in our MySQL database, and then we loop through them. That's what this for each result is. And then we do an upsert on the contacts. And let's look at the field mapper and the upsert on the contacts here. All right. And in fact, what I'm going to do? I'm just going to delete this block. All right. And we'll add a new block. Start from scratch, show you what it looks like. So we use an upsert operation on Salesforce, and we're going to select the contact entity. All right. And then we head to the field mapper on this. All right. And now notice that all these fields are blank. So what we're going to do is we're going to head over on the left-hand side. Now we notice there's only one entity in scope on the left-hand side. So we're going to select this entity. All right. They're going to have, we're going to select all, and then we're going to click Smart Mapper. And Smart Mapper is first going to tell us that it's not going to map any read-only fields, but then it's going to go and it's going to map all the fields that have similar names. All right. Now, the mapper used to only map fields that had an exact match, both in terms of capitalization and everything. But we've improved this to be a little smarter about how things get mapped. All right. And so let's look at, so getting back to here. So there's the selector box on the left-hand side. So for the source, we click the entity that we want to select for the source entity for the mapper, whereas previously used to only map at the top level entity. This allows us to select anything that's currently in scope. All right. This uses a better matching algorithm, so we're going to get more matches. But you do it skips the read-only fields, like we said. All right. But we do want to be sure that we confirm that the mappings are correct. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is you can end up with duplicates, right? So see how we have this. So see how we have the field in Salesforce, which is mobile phone, and this is the contact mobile phone. But it also mapped the mobile phone to the phone field. We might decide that we actually don't want that mapped out, all right? Aside from that, these field names are all pretty similar. And and that's how the mapper works. All right. So basically, it's pretty straightforward. You just select on the left-hand side which one you want to do, select all on the right, and then do Smart Mapper, and then you're good to go. You can also clear this out and start over again too. All right. But now let's look at let's see what it looks like for a child entity. So what I did here was actually just copy this map. All right. And now what we're going to do, and I just want to show you what it looks like when you reorganize the map to use child use a child entity instead of the actual top level entity. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to change this map all around. I'm going to change what entity I'm querying here. I'm going to change how the upsert works, and we'll show what it looks like. So instead, we're going to query the company object. All right. And we head into the include over here. Notice how right away that everything errored out. It's because none of these fields exist, right? These fields are all incorrect because the contact entity no longer exists in our scope. All right. So now we're going to go over to our company. We're going to actually include the contacts. All right. And we're going to loop through the contacts. All right. Now we're going to do a for each child. We're going to loop through the contacts, and then we're going to upsert the contact here. And now notice when we go into the fields here, all right? All of these fields, these contact, this doesn't exist anymore. This entity this name contact doesn't exist anymore because it's actually a child record. So it's actually, this is the one we want to map. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to select all, and I'm going to clear. All right. And then I'm going to head over and I'm going to, on this one, I'm going to select this as the child, select all, Smart Mapper, boom. And everything's mapped. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to take this phone one out because it's actually the mobile phone. So we'll take the phone one out. Where'd that go? Mobile phone. Take this one out. All right. All right. Also, the owner ID. This one's actually incorrect. Also, that's the thing, right? So when we're looking at the Smart Mapper, so the pro tip of this is you want to confirm the correct mappings. You could end up with duplicates, maybe not so bad, but you also have the potential to map not just primary key fields, but also parent key. All right, because so think about what's happening here on this source database. The owner ID is the foreign key of the parent in this table, but the owner ID over here is the foreign key within Salesforce, and that's not going to work because this one is actually a owner ID. In this case, is an integer, and this is a string. That's because that's what the key type is on the source. So things you want to check for are dupes and check for any primary keys as well as foreign keys in the target system because you might incorrectly map those. All right, but now the errors are all cleaned out and we're good to go. All right. So just to understand how that works, select that source entity, and then the smart mapper, just really be careful about duplicate fields, and it could be overzealous in the field mappings. Just confirm that none of those are primary keys. All right. Last thing we do is check how the mapper connector has been upgraded, and we head over to our connections. And what I've done here is I've made this little, what I call a common data model for my mapper. And these are some great improvements for the mapper connection, right? So what we have here now is the mapper connection now, it's set up much more like the text connector, right? So we have a much easier to manage entity list. So you can see here that my entities are on the left. Previously, there was one long screen. This screen is better. I can also generate an entity preview here, all right? So I can see what it actually looks like, all right? And now we also have this, we could also store CSV. Previously, JSON was the only option. Now we can store CSV, so you can put a sample CSV string in here. And that's good for a couple of reasons. I mean, you can store these things in memory. You can also create a very large string, which you can then write out, all right? So that's the key thing. The key improvements here are that we have this much improved entity list, similar to how it looks for the text connector. And this is actually stuff that's built into the core application, all right? Everything's happening behind the scenes using the APIs. All these values are stored up in our iPaaS via our API. But to make these effectively useful, we do need, there's a lot of care that goes into the UX itself, so that you can create the parameters for any particular connection. So connection has parameters, and in this case, the parameters here are the entity list as well as the different types that there are. All right. So that's how that looks from here, and just to show you what that looks like very quickly. So on our example here, and this is an example from a previous workshop that we did on advanced caching, but we'll just quickly show you how that comes into play here. All right. So what we're doing in this case is we are writing out to memory some contacts. So what I'm doing here is I'm looping through the contacts. I'm serializing CVS. Then I'm writing this out to memory as a variable. So basically everything looks exactly the same. With mapper, we have a serialize operation, and then we have a parse operation, right? And the parse operation is executed via the fetch and the lookup. Okay. So the serialize basically writes it out. It creates a string. So the serialized CSV, what does this look like here? It's a pretty basic thing. This creates basically a string, a CSV string that has these values in it. All right. And then now we can actually parse this. Oh, and I actually thought of something too. If you have a CSV string, you can actually now parse that string using the mapper. All right. So the mapper now gives us the ability to parse a CSV string directly from the mapper. But in this case, we're both serializing it, and then we're going to parse it later on. And then when we parse it, we just do everything work exactly the same. We do the parse on that. All right. All right. So those are the functions. That's everything we have for our new features within TIBCO Cloud Integration. Thank everyone for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in our session next month. Also, keep an eye out. We're going to have general office hours now, where you can just call in and you can just zoom in and ask questions. And we'll be sending out information on that, and check the website for that also. All right. So everyone, thanks for your time, and we'll see you next month.